So, we're going to begin this study in the book of Colossians, and it's going to go for about 4 weeks or so. Kind of see how our discussion goes, 3-4 weeks. And to begin, what I want to talk about is that there's a deception going on in society. And actually, right before we start, if it's not too much trouble, can I have people over here sit over here? It's just much easier to kind of like get us all in one place, be able to look over here, and then we feel. So there's a bit of deception going on in society, especially with respect to how much technology we have, and one of the things that we keep on saying that technology does, which is nice, but it is two-edged, is that technology brings us into connection with a lot of people, right? So we use technology to stay connected to a lot of people, reach out to people we wouldn't normally see, and so we feel that we're able to keep up with different people, all right? And more people than we were easily 10 years ago, we are keeping up with more people than we used to because of technology. But one of the things that has deceived us with respect to technology and the ability to, be connected to other people is that it has deceived us because though we are connected to many people, we are not as knowledgeable about other people, right? So we know different things are going on in other people's lives. We know like so-and-so got engaged or this person had a baby and da-da-da-da. And we actually know almost too much of what's going on in other people's lives because people tell us, oh, I'm in Terminal A at JFK. I don't really care if you're Terminal A, right? But, we know almost a little too much superficial knowledge about everybody because of what social media and technology has done. And so connection has actually taken away a bit of intimacy with respect to how well we actually know other people, right? And if we look, and if you even just kind of forget about the studies, if you go around and ask people, do you feel more connected or do you feel more lonely in present society? I think more people will be honest and say, well, I feel more lonely than I actually do feel connected, right? I don't have as many close friends. I don't know that many people very closely, though if we look at kind of our social media feeds and different social media accounts, it would actually say otherwise. But yet we kind of have this dichotomy going on where we are connected, but yet we're still lonely. Like there is a disconnect in our intimate knowledge of people, in our closeness to people as a result. So there's a deception going on, right? And that deception is growing and getting worse. And it's confusing us with respect to what it is to really know somebody intimately, right? To really be close to them. And one of the people that we need to be extremely close to is God, right? We all need to be very intimate with God. We all want to have a deep knowledge of God. But we've been a bit deceived on how to grow in that knowledge of God, right? We've been deceived to some extent on how to grow in that knowledge of God, right? And I don't think that any of these things are bad in themselves, okay? But I think they are double-edged, okay? I think with the ease that we have with respect to gaining access to sermons and talks and different things, I think it's a good thing. But I think there is a bit of deception as to how much I'm actually able to learn about God from those things, from listening to a sermon, or from, all these different options for podcasts that we have out there, right? These are good things. And these are different things that we use to know about God, okay? Know different things about God. But sometimes we allow it to suffice our appetite of knowing God. And this is similar to what the church in Colossus was kind of struggling with, okay? And the church in Colossians in Colossae, right, they had received the message of the gospel, okay? As Paul came through, he actually didn't go directly to Colossae. He preached around the area, and Epaphras, which I always mess up his name. Let me get it here. Epaphras, okay, was somebody who heard Paul's message and carried the message to the church in Colossae, all right? But in that area, one of the things that kind of seeped into the area, which really prompted Paul to write the letter to the church in Colossae, was this idea of, well, how do we know God? How do I become closer to God? And the ideology that was coming in was coming from the agnostics, okay? And the agnostics are people, okay, who believe that there was a secret knowledge that I would learn about God, and it was through that knowledge of God that I would receive salvation, right? So it was, if you will, like very theoretical, okay? As I learn secretly about God, then it's going to pave the way for my salvation, okay? That's how I was going to ultimately save. Just like think really hard, read, and like to some people, knowledge of God was revealed, and therefore that's how we kind of work towards salvation. I'm kind of simplifying it a bit. But what was happening is that the church in Colossae was learning about the gospel, okay, but then learning about Gnosticism, and they were kind of confusing different things. They're confusing like, well, how do I actually like begin to know God and become very intimate with God? Is it really just about hearing and knowing Him, or is there something else that really paves the way for me to know God? And what was happening is something that happens present day, which is syncretism, okay? Syncretism is a word, and I put the definition here, okay? But this is something that the church in Colossae, as well as present day, I think we struggle with tremendously. And what syncretism is it's the combining of different beliefs, okay? It's a combining of different beliefs while blending practices of various schools of thought, okay? So it's different belief systems, but there's some like similarities, so we'll just kind of blend them together, okay? We'll synchronize, if you will, two different belief systems, bring it together, and find some sort of compromise, all right? Syncretism involves the merging or assimilation of several originally discrete traditions. So two things that if you looked at their kind of at the bare naked truth about them, they would be very different. But over time, we've kind of merged them, okay? Syncretism, all right? And this happens with theology, and this happens with mythology and religion. This is how we see it. So it's not something that is specific just to what happens in our Christian faith. This happens like everywhere. But this kind of approach is very common. This is something we're all struggling with, right? We're all struggling with is, what do I really believe? What does the church really believe? You know, and we're trying to supplement it. Sometimes we can supplement using different sources, and what happens is we can get very confused. So the church in Colossae was confused, if you will, about, well, how do I know God? Right? St. Paul is telling me one thing, or the message of the gospel is telling me one thing about who God is and how do I know Him, but then the Gnostics are coming in and kind of bringing a different approach. And we're very similar, and this is why I think the letter to the Colossians is very applicable to us, because frequently what happens is we like to synchronize God to my preferences. Okay? We like to synchronize God to my preferences. I learn about Him through a unique set of speakers. I learn about Him through a specific podcast. I learn about Him through how I like to pray and when I like to pray, and, you know, my preferred Bible reading, whether it's existent or non-existent, right? So we kind of like say, but this is how I know God. And again, none of those things in and of themselves is wrong, okay? But God is infinite, and God has to be learned in multiple different ways and through multiple different avenues, and Scripture and prayer and through the church are different ways. But what we like to do is say, let me do it my way, Okay, I'll use all these different tools, but I'll do it my way. And so the next question that I want to throw out is, as we've kind of tailored how I want to know God, okay, would you say as a society, we're becoming closer and closer and more intimate with God? Or would you say as a society and as a body of believers, we are slowly going further away? Would you agree with, we like to learn about God on my terms? Okay? Thank you for being honest, okay? I'm going to raise your hand. I'm raising my hand. We like to learn about God on my terms, okay? But then when you look as a whole, do you see that as a whole, like we are a group of people who are really getting closer to God, or do you see us kind of slipping? Slipping is what I would say. I would say I kind of see like a slipping. Sarah, go ahead. Okay.
But I guess the definition of
Syncretism?
yes, thank you. Talking about like allowing, serving in the last part, underlying unity and allowing for an inclusive approach to other faiths. So
Mm-hmm.
this thing that you're saying is very much relevant to our society.
Yeah.
That we just like let's just all get along. Let's just make it if we can kind of find the similarities, which is not. It's not innately a bad thing. Like it's
No.
a thing that we want to find like common ground.
Mm-hmm.
If we are like slurring things in order to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think what's happening is the way you put it is like we're slurring things, okay, according to what is comfortable to me or how I like to do things. And what happens is that as an individual, we're finding more and more kind of asking these questions, well, who is God or where is God in my life? We kind of struggle with this, which has to do with like our image of God, right? Is he very present? Am I like connected with him? Do I really know him? Or is he very absent or lucid, right? So this is what was happening in the church in Colossus, okay? And St. Paul wrote to the church in Colossus after Epaphras, okay, came to Rome when Paul was in prison, and he said, this is what's going on in the church in Colossus. So Paul, in prison, wrote a letter, which he sent back with Epaphras, to give to the church in Colossus, okay, and to read in the church of Colossus. And so it's considered one of his prison epistles, okay? And there's a couple epistles that Paul wrote in prison. Anybody want to take a stab? Sorry? Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, Galatians. I wrote them down. Yeah. Oh, Philemon, Philippians, Ephesians, Galatians, and Colossians. Okay? Those are the four that were considered written when Paul was in prison. Okay, the prison epistles. And so when we begin to open up the book in Colossians, we're going to see right away how Paul begins to address this idea of, well, how do we know God? And then he goes on to really pick apart, like, what does it actually mean to actually, when we say know God, what are we actually talking about? All right, so when we look in verse 1, okay, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God. Okay, and Timothy, our brother, but let's just pause here. An apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. When you think of an apostle of Jesus Christ, somebody who is sent out, you think, who would Jesus send out? Who does God send out? Those loosely associated with him or have a vague idea of who he is? Or does he send out somebody who is very knowledgeable about who he is? You would want to send out somebody who's very knowledgeable about who he is, right? You don't want somebody going and being an ambassador for you or an apostle for you who's very confused about who you are. So he's saying, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ is sending him out because there's a knowledge, okay? And what does that knowledge of him hinge on? The will of God, okay? The will of God. And interestingly, when we look at Paul, okay, we actually read his story today in the book of Acts. Right? So what was the book of Acts about? Acts chapter 9, Paul's conversion. He was on the road, and the bright light, he was on the road to go punish the Christians. Bright light came, blinded him. 3 days in silence and fasting and internal reflection. And then he chooses Ananias, and he calls Ananias, the priest, who's like, Paul is here. I want you to go, and I want you to lay your hands on him and baptize him. And if we look at what the Lord says to Ananias, he says, go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine, to bear my name before the Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. So we look at what's happening to Paul and how Paul addresses himself or opens the book of Colossians. He says, Apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. Right? What was the will of God for Paul? Is that you will go and you will bear my name. Paul worked and served within the will of God, which then gave him an intimate knowledge of who God is. Right? So it's because of Paul's intimate experience with God, and that God was saying, this is how I want you to live. This is how I'm sending you out. Paul is linking the idea of abiding by the will of God to the knowledge of God. Okay? Because as an apostle, there's a knowledge of God that you must have. But how did Paul find that? It was the will of God. Okay? And what was the will of God? Well, he sat Paul on the road, blinded him, took him into the city, and waited for Ananias to come and baptize him. All right, so that was in Acts 9:15. But when we look a little bit further into the book of Colossians, right, we want to pick apart this understanding of the will of God and the knowledge of God and see how they are see how they're linked. Because as all of us should be and are striving for a deeper knowledge or more intimate knowledge of God, we also tend to ask the question, well, what is God's will for me? So we want to bring these two together. Okay, we want to bring these two together. And so if we creep down to verse 5. Verse 5. Because of the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before in the word of truth of the gospel. All right, so we'll kind of pick it apart piece by piece. Because of the hope which was laid up for you in heaven. All right, so the church in Colossae heard the gospel, and the gospel talked to them about salvation, which is the hope laid up for you in heaven, okay, which you heard. So Paul's saying, which you heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel. So in the message that came to you, you heard about salvation. It says, which has come to you as it did also in all the world and is bringing forth fruit. So Paul's saying something special here, because if we think about what's happening in the church of Colossae, the Gnostics are coming in and saying, like, it's actually a very special knowledge about God, okay, that helps us work towards salvation. Not everybody has it, but very special people learn about God, and therefore they work towards salvation. What Paul is saying is that you heard the gospel, you heard it in truth, and this truth is being preached in all the world. Okay, so he's saying it's not privatized. The message of the gospel, the message of salvation, isn't private. It's not to one specific person or a group of people. It's something that goes to the whole world. And he attaches a certain quality to it. He attaches to the message of the gospel, which is spread globally, that it brings forth fruit. Right? So Paul's linking that the message of the gospel brings forth a fruit, and that fruit or that message is for the whole world, and therefore the whole world can bring fruit. And if we just go into verse 7, it says, as it is also among you, since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. Okay? as it is also among you, and since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. And this is where we want to talk about what it is this word "new" is. So when we look at this word "new," okay, the Greek word for it is gnosis. It's the only time I'm going to get into the Greek, all right? So gnosis is knowledge, okay? But then there's another word in Greek similar, epignosis, okay? Epignosis and gnosis. Gnosis is just knowledge, and epignosis, okay, is intimate knowledge. And the word in Scripture right now, in this verse, is epignosis, which is intimate knowledge, and not just intimate knowledge, but observance, okay? Observance. And I kind of shared in the sermon earlier today about we know things, but we don't necessarily observe all things, okay? We know what the speed limit is. Do we always observe the speed limit? No. You get busted by a cop, you'll observe the speed limit for the next 25 miles until you slowly slouch back into your speeding habits, okay? We know we shouldn't text and drive, okay? Do we always observe that? We know that these certain practices are good for us, but we don't always observe that, okay? Observance of something that we know brings us into a more intimate knowledge of what we know. It means it's actually like we're giving it a certain value and a certain significance, and therefore I'm willing to observe it as a result, right? So this might sound like a funny example, but bear with me, okay? If you are married and you have friends who are married, okay, you know each other's spouses, okay? You know their names, you know what they look like, you know who they're married to. But do you know their spouses? No, you don't. You don't because you don't observe the rules that the spouse lays in the house. You don't observe that. And because you don't observe the rules in which govern the house, you can't know the other person, right? But the spouse who lives in the house, who has all these rules, knows their spouse, knows what they like, knows what they dislike, and knows what will upset them, knows what makes them happy. And when they observe these things, then you would say they have an intimate knowledge of each other, right? You start to get in a conversation, and all of a sudden you see one spouse say, I'm not going to go there. I know if I get into this conversation, what's going to happen with me? That's because they have an intimate knowledge of their spouse, right? Because there's an observance of kind of the properties of how the relationship will work. Same thing with God. We know that God desires certain things of us, but we don't always observe those things, right? We know that God challenges us to really manage our finances in a certain way. Do we always observe it? Not really, or sometimes. We know that God desires that we forgive one another. Do we always observe the command to forgive, which is laced into the prayer of our Lord? No, but we know it's there, but we don't always observe it as if it's His will for us. Question?
One question just come.
Yeah.
I just have comment about the relationship.
Sure.
I personally, I see a difference.
Okay.
God, for me, it's love of Christian love. It's not like, yeah, I'm going to go out because I know observe. It's relationship with like he's my father.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel that that's the relationship between definitely for me with my spouse or spouses or as a human being together. That's for me.
Sure. I agree. It is a relationship of love.
It's not like if I'm disobeying
Yeah.
I'm not observing. No, that's because of my fault for not trying to return the love of what he did. But spouses or human being as a journalist, that's me.
No, I think that's fine. I was just trying to use an example. Like what allows us to gain intimate knowledge of like a spouse or another person that we're getting close to. It's like they say certain things, we learn it, and out of our love to them, we observe it, right? And that brings us into an intimate knowledge of how this person works. Like, I know how they tick, I know how they think, I know when I bring this conversation up with them, I kind of know how they're going to approach it, right? That's an intimate knowledge of somebody, right? And how do we gain that intimate knowledge? It's when we observe and we kind of abide by the uniqueness of their personality and their character, right? So we learn about them in the observation of how they function, right? And what they like or dislike, all these different things. So it brings us into an intimate knowledge of them. It's not like a domineering sort of thing. Like, I was just kind of trying to use an example, but intimate knowledge comes in close observation and respect of another person. Do you have a question? Oh. All right. So what Paul is saying in this verse, okay, as it is also among you since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. Right? So they received the gospel, they heard of the gospel, they knew of the grace of God in truth. Right? And the grace of God is always bestowing on us a certain power. Okay? A certain power to live according to the way that He has called us to live. Okay? Some of us feel like it is really difficult to forgive. Well, what do we need? We need God's grace. We need His grace to forgive. Well, it's really difficult when it's financially tight to donate. So what do we need? We need His grace. Okay? And so there's a will, God's will in the situation, which is to bear the fruit of forgiveness. Bear the fruit of being generous. Bear the fruit of mercy. All these different things that are considered the fruits of the Spirit. So all these different things, God wants us to bear these fruits. Is it always easy? No. But when we observe what God is leading us to do and what He is teaching us to do, that brings us into a more intimate knowledge of Him. Because it causes us to rely on Him. It causes us to rely on Him. And that reliance on Him and observance of His will leads to a change in us that is marked by the bearing of fruit. Okay? The change in us, the abiding by His will, and which leads us into a more intimate knowledge of Him, is marked by the bearing of fruit. And so St. Anthony the Great, and I bring one other quote, said this. He's like, the truly intelligent man pursues one sole objective, to obey and conform to the God of all. For the knowledge of God and faith in Him is the salvation and perfection of the soul. For the knowledge of God and faith in Him, so we're kind of linking knowledge of God. How do I grow in my knowledge of God? Is to abide in His will. And His will is always going to lead us to live and walk and act in a certain way that would bear fruits, okay? And it's difficult, and so we're going to have to rely on Him, which is the faith aspect of it. But ultimately, conforming my will to His is going to lead me towards salvation. Kind of coming at it from another angle. St. Isaac the Syrian said, when he's talking about people who are far off, he says, I beg and beseech you, Lord, grant to all who have gone astray a true knowledge of you, so that each and every one may come to know your glory. So what is he saying? Like when he's referring, I want them to have a true knowledge of you, he's not saying, I want them to be aware of you, or I want them to know of you. What he's saying is like, I want them to know and observe your will for them, which will bring them into a true knowledge of you, and is marked by the bearing of fruits. And we're going to end on this verse, verses 9 and 10 in Colossians. So St. Paul says, that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will. All right, so he's again linking the knowledge of God and to be the knowledge of His will, in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, being fruitful in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. this growth, or our growth, in the knowledge of God, in our intimacy with God, is very active. It's never static. Okay? Frequently, what happens is that we come to certain situations in life where we ask, what is God's will in this? Which is not a wrong question. Okay? It's not a wrong question to ask, okay, in this big decision that's coming up, what's His will? It's a good question to ask. The only problem with that question is we tend to just stop at the question. We just say, like, okay, do you want me to go take this job or this job? Okay? And I think what St. Paul is kind of challenging us to say, yes, he may want you to choose one job or another. Okay? But in choosing the job that he is kind of leading us towards, as we continue in that job, are we continuing to bear fruits? Because if we're just saying, God, which job should I take? Or which path or which decision should I make? And we just leave it at that and say, okay, God's will is about this one decision, we've stopped short. Because God may lead us in a certain direction, but our experience throughout this new job that we decide to take brings us into an intimate knowledge of God. Because is it always going to be easy in that job to bear fruit? Is it always going to be a morally straight path at work? No, it's not. Are you going to come into challenging situations or compromising situations if you choose this job, which is part of His will? Yes, you are. And it's in every good work, in every good opportunity, that if we're looking and saying, like, okay, what does God want for me in this situation and in this moment, talking with this person? How does He want me to control my tongue? How does He want me to speak the truth? How does He want me to work with integrity? All these different things. And when we ask those questions in every moment, with every email, with every interaction with a coworker, or whatever the situation may be, when we ask those questions, we are stepping into a lifetime of abiding in His will. And in all those situations, when we ask God, how are you asking me to deal with this coworker? And He's like, I want you to show mercy to them. We bear a good fruit. We bear a good fruit. We continue to bear good fruit. And in that process of kind of taking every opportunity in every situation and trying to see them through new eyes and just say, it wasn't just about the big situation, but it was about all the situations on this path in which God is desiring me to bear fruits, that I will have to look and ask the question, am I abiding by His will? And if I am willing and courageous enough to abide by His will, then I will grow in the knowledge of Him. Because we may look at a certain situation and be like, if I really tell this person the truth about the situation, or if I say, no, I cannot do that because I find this to be morally compromising, right? We might find ourselves in tough situations. But it's in those tough situations that we are allowing ourselves to see the hand of God working in them. And that brings us into a much more intimate knowledge of who God is and how He works in me and in my life and in all decisions in every moment. And in all those situations, we will be strengthened with all His might according to His glorious power for all patience and long suffering. It's never bearing the fruits of abiding by His will. It's never a one-time thing. It's always a continuous thing, right? And bearing fruits for Him, we can all look at our situations and be like, should not have done that in that situation. Wish I could take those words back. I wish that I didn't agree to do that. I wish all these different things, right? We miss those opportunities. But new opportunities will present, okay? And I need to be patient and long-suffering and thinking that it's always in the small situations and the daily interactions that I have the opportunity to abide by His will, which bears fruits which then brings me into a more intimate knowledge of Him. Okay? And because God is infinite, there is never a time when we aren't growing in our knowledge of Him. It never stops. And therefore, like, we can look at all the situations, all the small moments in life, and they all present an opportunity. An opportunity to bear fruits and to grow in knowledge. But we have to be patient and long-suffering and approach it with joy. Any questions? 30 minutes. I'll end up. Okay? Stand up, pray. We'll continue to kind of dive through the book of Colossians together over the next couple of weeks.